Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
We're continuing with this class and we're talking about helping to build your own theology or idea about God to accompany you in your davening using elements from the history of Jewish theology, and we're starting Kabbalah. So we talked about the Bible, we talked about rabbinics, then we got medieval, we talked about medieval philosophy, Rambam, and now we're up to medieval mysticism. And we'll be doing that for at least the next couple of months. And that's my first intro. Second intro. Mysticism means a lot of things. Technically, what I'm talking about is a specific tradition called Kabbalah, which means that which is received or handed on. Originally, some of this literature was oral, and that's why it was called Kabbalah. It starts, classical medieval Kabbalah arises somewhere around 1100-ish. There are a couple of early books called Sefer HaBahir and Sefer Yetzirah, which you can find all of this material now on Sefaria. All of it's been published also in plain old-fashioned paper and print books with English translations. And we're going to look at two classic formulations. One is the Zohar, and the other is going to be the Ari, Rav Isaac Luria. And they have different formulations of the Kabbalistic tradition. And then Hasidism is the heirs of them, and we may look at some mysticism in Hasidut also. We'll see how things evolve. So first we're going to be talking about the Zohar, and we're going to be talking about the Zohar for about the next couple of months or so. The Zohar, which is the classic book of Jewish medieval Kabbalah, is traditionally internally attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, a 2nd century sage, contemporary of Rabbi Akiva, let's say. Most contemporary scholars will disagree with that, and they will say that it was probably written around the late 1200s, let's just say 1300, close enough for government work, by a man named Rabbi Moses de Leon in Castile, Spain, written mostly in Aramaic, not exactly Talmudic Aramaic, kind of his version of medieval Aramaic. And the Zohar came to be venerated by Sephardi Jews and there were arguments about which was holier, the Talmud or the Zohar, and which outranks each. We know we're heirs to this. Oh, you're not supposed to study the Zohar till you're 40 years old. That's actually an Ashkenazi thing. Sephardim studied the Zohar all the time, as part of their education. They didn't wait till they were 40 years old. So for Sephardim, the Talmud and the Zohar were, I'm going to speak very loosely, roughly equivalent sacred works after the Torah, after the Tanakh, after the Bible. Okay? Like next after the Bible in their sacredness, Talmud and Zohar side by side. Talmud teaching you what to do and how to live. Zohar teaching you the concepts behind that. So although on the one hand it's esoteric, which means knowledge that is not for everyone, it wasn't really treated by Sephardim as esoteric. Everyone studied the Zohar. And if you look at a Sephardi Siddur, there are certain passages of Zohar that are studied every day. The thing that we say when we take the Torah out of the Ark on Shabbat morning, Brich Shmei, that comes from the Zohar. That's the one that has really stuck in the Ashkenazi Siddur through all editions. Okay, a generalization about Zoharic literature. If we say that rabbinic ideas about God are more or less what we would call mythical and anthropomorphic, agadic, to use the Hebrew word, God stands up from one throne and sits on another throne. Sometimes God looks like a young man of war. Sometimes God looks like a lover. Sometimes God looks like an old man on a throne with a beard. God wraps God's self in a talit and tefillin like a shliach tzibur. Someone has a vision of God, and God nods God's head and says, Ishmael, my son, give me a blessing. So these things that we saw in the Midrash, rabbinic Midrash, I would call them mythic, anthropomorphic. You can say, did the rabbis really believe these things literally? They don't seem to ask that question. They don't seem troubled by that question. We're troubled by that question, but they don't seem troubled by that question. And in contrast to that, we saw Maimonides, who said, none of that's literally true. It's all a metaphor, and God is the most abstract thing that you could possibly imagine, but you can't even imagine it. It's that abstract. It's just pure mind, okay? And you use your mind to try to apprehend the pure mind. It's the most non-mythic thing in the world. Everyone follow me? So the Zohar is back to a more mythic view, but a lot of the language that the Zohar uses is imagistic. So there's stuff about upper waters and lower waters, a rose unfolding and wafting off a scent, a point of light which expands and sends out shoots of light, flows of light. Did I say upper? I said upper waters and lower waters, upper waters and lower, male and female getting together. So there's a lot of, I would call it physicality in the Zohar, sort of like in rabbinic Agadah, but it's more imagistic than anthropomorphic. It's not unanthropomorphic, but there's a lot of images. Okay? And again, as with all imagistic things, poetry or whatnot, we got to ask ourselves, what are they trying to communicate through these images, and how do they land for us? Okay. Us means, okay, I may not believe literally as a 2024 person of the scientific era. I may not believe literally that there are upper waters and lower waters trying to join each other. Is there something that the Zohar is saying within that, some idea that's contained within that is useful to me? Or is it just like gobbledygook, right? There's a famous story, of course. Gershon Sholem at Hebrew U was the famous scholar of Zohar, and he was giving a talk about the Zohar, and Rabbi Saul Lieberman, the great Talmudist at JTS, both of them came from Europe, was at the lecture, and he was saying something about the Zohar says this, and Lieberman said, well, Professor Sholem, but everyone knows that the Zohar is nonsense. And Sholem responded, yes, nonsense is nonsense, but the history of nonsense is scholarship. So I am not coming from the standpoint of a rose is nonsense. I'm coming from the standpoint that a rose is an image. A rose that gives off scent is an image. Male and female uniting to become whole is an image. The Shekhinah being in exile and crying is an image. And the question I'm going to ask us to ask ourselves do these images strike us as like as Rambam might say? Rambam was totally opposed to mysticism. Would Rambam say it's total nonsense, total anthropomorphic nonsense? Okay, or a lot of it's not about human form, so we couldn't call it anthropomorphic, but physicalizing nonsense? Or do we see it as imagistic, poetic, in a way that can open up ideas for us? That's my basic opening statement. Now, there are a lot of things in the Zohar and Kabbalah that we're not going to study because we're focusing on God. So there's all kinds of stuff on the nature of evil, the nature of humans, the soul and where it comes from, reincarnation of souls, reward and punishment, history of Israel and exile, the future and the Messiah. So there are all kinds of stuff about this in the Zohar. Zohar isn't just about God, but because of our class, we're focusing on God. And again, all these things now are available in English. So if you're interested and you want to study more, there's certainly opportunities to do that. There are all kinds of classes online, etc. So we're going to talk about the nature. So all of that by way of intro. The next few weeks, we're going to be talking about ideas about God, the nature of God in the Zohar. That's how we got to where we are. Classic of Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah of about the year 1300 in Spain. And we're going to be looking at a number of things, which I will just now foreshadow. The concept of the infinite, which is infinite God or infinity, which is called the Ein Sof, which means limitless or endless. The Sfirot, or 10 channels through which divine energy flows into our world. Call them channels for the moment. The Shekhinah, God's presence in our world, which is the lowest of the 10 Sfirot, and male and female aspects of God. I think that's what we're going to look at. Ein Sof, the Sfirot, the Shekhinah, and male and female. And if anyone has any idea about something else that you think we should be including in that, please let me know. And by the way, if you say things like light that flowed into vessels and the vessels broke, and so there's sparks of light in everything, but they're covered by husks, and it's our job to remove the husks to return the light to its source, which is God. That is the Kabbalah of Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Ari. So that's going to be chapter 2 of Kabbalistic thinking. We're doing chapter 1 and chapter 2. Chapter 1 is the Zohar. Chapter 2 is Luria. And very often we don't, unless you go back to sources, when the Hasidim quote it, they quote the Zohar and they quote the Ari, and they don't really, they'll tell you where they're quoting from, but they don't really distinguish them. For them, it's all one received body. For us, it's like, there's the prophets and the writings, and it's all part of one Bible. Okay, so for them, it's all part of one knowledge of Jewish mysticism, and they don't necessarily privilege one or the other. It's all one ball of wax. But if we're going in historical order, it's not all one ball of wax. It's the Zohar 1300-ish. By the way, the Ari is in the middle of the 1500s. His stuff was published by the year 1600, so we're talking about 300 years later, 2 stages. Okay? That's where we're at. Are there any questions about the formulation of any of that before we jump into some text? Alan, I hear you. You're unmuted.
Okay. Yeah. You were saying that they treat Lurianic Hasidim, Lurianic and Zohar together as one and as sacred as it's number 2.
Not the Hasidim. Sephardim treat the Zohar as a holy book like the Talmud. They don't consider it as like, no one studies that. You might wait till you're 40 to study it, but it's not for the masses. They don't see it that way. It's for the masses and it's studied. Go ahead. That's for Sephardim.
Thank you for the clarification. I was confused that.
Yeah.
Did the Sephardim view these books as the same as some Orthodox Jews view, or we may view Talmud as, from God? Do they view that in the same way?
No, they view it just like the Talmud is the record of human conversations. The Zohar is a book of conversations among sages of the Talmudic era, and it was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the 2nd century. So the traditional view is this book was written by Shimon Bar Yochai, and in the Zohar there is kind of a framework, which is the scholars are wandering around Eretz Yisrael and they ask a question, or they bump into an old man who they think is foolish, but he starts talking, and afterwards they sit down and they realize that he was spouting great wisdom. Or there's a child who sounds, so there's a framework of the scholars are meeting and talking, not quite as concrete as the Talmud is, right? But it was written edited by Shimon Bar Yochai. That is the traditional Sephardic view. That would also be the traditional Ashkenazic view. It's just the difference is Sephardim say, and we study it like we study the Talmud. It's part of our sacred literature. Ashkenazim said, this is not for the mainstream, and regular people shouldn't be studying it, and you only study it under certain conditions. It's esoteric, and it is not meant for the masses. That was the general Ashkenazi view. Sorry, it's the general Ashkenazi misnagdish view. The Hasidic view was that Zohar and the Ari, Lurianic Kabbalah, are part of our inherited fount of wisdom. Right. So if you look at a Hasidic work, okay, they quote the Bible, they quote the Talmud, they quote the Ari, they quote the Zohar. Right. They're making a sermon and they quote all of these things. Doesn't mean they thought that it was equal to the Bible, okay, in holiness, but this is all part of our received tradition for the Hasidim, okay? And there were even mitnagdim who studied the Zohar, like the Gra, Elijah of Vilna, the great mitnagdic figure of the late 1700s who was totally anti the Hasidim. He studied Zohar, but he didn't believe that I should study Zohar. I guess maybe I could because I was over 40, right? But he didn't believe that regular people should study Zohar. The mitnagdim, the opponents to the Hasidim, the people who were yeshiva based, were Talmud based, and they did not believe regular people should study mysticism. And our Ashkenormative, as is the term nowadays, our Ashkenormative tradition is really the heirs of the yeshiva-based mitnagdish view. Follow that, Alan? Yes. So that is why the Zohar is not, that's why we don't teach the Zohar at the Pressman Academy. Okay. If you go to a Haredi day school in LA, do they teach Zohar? I don't know. When did they start doing Zohar? I don't know. I'm going to ask, next time I bumped into a from Haredi person, I'm going to ask them that. Okay?
Okay.
But if you open the Sephardic Siddur, there are passages from the Zohar in the daily prayers, not just Brich Shmei when they take the Torah out, but a bunch of other ones, right? So it's part of the fountain of knowledge. Okay, it's 8:35. We got to go on. Okay, let's do some Zohar. You'll be a little disappointed because the first thing we're going to do this week, you'll say, it's not that different than Maimonides. Okay, I will share this. So I'm just warning you. Okay, so the Zohar has a whole theory of 10 channels or emanations of the energy of God called the Sfirot, which we're going to get to, I hope, next week. Okay. But they say there's something above, in air quotes, the Sfirot, or beyond the Sfirot. The Sfirot is about the dynamic life of God. God as evolving, changing, flowing. But there's something beyond that or above that. And that is called the Ein Sof. Okay? That's their term for, it's their technical term for the God that we cannot understand anything about. And Ein Sof literally means endless or limitless, generally translated into English as the infinite, which technically means the same thing, not finite, right? And this is we're going to start with a passage about the Olah, the sacrifice. By the way, much of the Zohar is written as a commentary on the Torah portions. Okay? So Rabbi Elazar asked Rabbi Shimon, okay, and you'll see already the language of the Zohar, by the way, it's imagistic and also a little bit elliptical. Like, what does it mean exactly? The burnt offering, the Olah, is bound, kishur, right, is bound, tied together, to the Holy of Holies, so that it may shine. The devotion, or the cleaving together of the desire of Kohanim, Leviim, and Yisraelim, right, the temple worship somehow joins together all three categories, right? Because the daily olah, the daily offering, is brought from the community of all of Israel, from our temple taxes. The helpers are Leviim, and the people who offer the sacrifice are Kohanim. So all three groups of Jews are bound together in this act of offering up the sacrifice. Ad hechan ihu salka. How far does it go up? Again, and this is a question about the binding together of it. The thing that's all bound together, the sacrifice, which is connected to the Holy of Holies in the temple, which unites the efforts of Kohanim, Yisraelim, and Leviim. Where does it ascend to? And he says, we already know the answer. This devotion ascends to Ein Sof, to the infinite, meaning it ascends to the highest aspect of divinity. Can you hold on, Michael? Because I just want to finish it. Okay. Because all things, all objects, right? Because because all these things which are bound and completed and I'm going to just read it in English so you see how hard it is to understand. The object of bond, unison, and completeness is to hide well that which cannot be perceived or known, where abides the will of all wills. So there's something up there. The point of it all, the olah, the burnt offering, is to get to something that cannot be perceived or known. The Ein Sof, the infinite. It is endless and not subject to knowledge, nor does it have a beginning or an end. And that's where I would say, you'd say, oh, that's Maimonides. Okay. That's Maimonides' idea of God. And here in the Kabbalah, it's referred to as the Ein Sof, the infinite. It actually gets a name and that's because later on we're going to read about other aspects of God which have other names. Okay. So the purpose of the olah is to bind all these things together and to have the intention, the devotion ascend. How far does it ascend? It's like a Talmudic question. Answer, all the way to Ein Sof. And what is Ein Sof? It's the thing that cannot be known and cannot be described and does not have a beginning or an end. Now I'm going to pause. Michael.
Yes, it just struck me that your description of binding together Kohanim, Leviim, and Yisrael reminded me of the structure for Torah reading, where traditionally first Kohen, then Levi, and then... Correct.
So if you wanted to write, I don't know, somewhere in the Zohar, does it say, and now we don't offer sacrifices, we do the Torah reading, and we call Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael. There's a lot of stuff in the Zohar about Kohen, Levi, and Israel. There's a lot of stuff about binding together. Okay. By the way, Kohen, Levi, and Israel is bound together. Male and female is bound together. Upper waters and lower waters have to get bound together. There's a lot of stuff about connecting because the Zohar, and this is really amplified by the Ari, chapter 2 of mysticism, because the Zohar talks about that we live in a world of separation. We live in this world. Okay. See my four fingers? We live in this world where everything seems separate. And a goal of a lot of religion is to, and that things are separate is an illusion. And a goal of religion, a major goal of religion, is to move beyond the illusion and to connect things, to see that they're actually really connected. Footnote. The ultimate expression of this, I think, is in Chabad, Lubavitch, the Tanya, which says, I'm not sure, I don't know if this is made up in the Tanya. I could be right or I could be wrong about it. Could be elsewhere in Chassidut. Leit atar panui mine. There is no place which is devoid of God. God is in everything. The fact that we are separate beings, that we think we're separate beings, you and me, that is an illusion. Okay? And it's the job of the religious person to be able to move beyond the illusion, to see that there is divinity in everything, and that means that everything is connected. Lubavitch Chabad Chassidut is pan and theistic. It sees God in everything. So the fact that different things, Jews and Palestinians are laboring under an illusion that they're opposed and they're fighting, and that's about sort of like my left hand punching my right shoulder. It's as foolish as that. Sorry, I got political. Okay. Second passage from the Zohar, quoting a verse that we're going to read in Ha'azinu this week, which is not why I selected it. That was coincidence. Okay. The verse in Ha'azinu is Re'u ata ki ani anihu ve'ein Elohim imadi. Look now, it's me. Me is the one. There is no other God with me or next to me. That's what it means in Ha'azinu. Okay? Chavraya, says Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says friends. That's his gathered band of scholars. Okay? I have to reveal these ancient words after I have gotten permission to say them. Revealing secrets. What does it mean? This verse, Re'u ata ki ani anihu. Look, now, it's me, says God. This means that God is Ilat al kol ilain, which is translated here as the cause above all causes. You could say that. It could also mean the above, which is above all aboves. It can mean either one. The above, which is above all, beyond all aboves. By the way, and then there's a part of the passage which I've left out, which says there are the sfirot, there are lower levels, and each one has a level above it. But this level, has no above it. There is no above it. The cause of causes, which totally sounds like Rambam, right? Prime mover, right? It's the cause that has no causes, which we learned, which everyone says is Neo-Aristotelian, which I'll take that on faith because I don't know what that actually means. Okay? It is called Ilat al kol ilot, the highness, the above, beyond all aboves, or cause beyond all causes, because there is nothing above it. There is nothing above it, and nothing below it is equal to it. Okay? As it says in Isaiah, this is, I think, the Haftarah of Breshit coming up in a few weeks. Who can you compare me to that I will be likened to, says the Holy One? It's a rhetorical question. Who could you possibly compare me to? Rhetorical question. Obvious answer, like no one. Okay, so this verse means there's some, let's call it aspect of divinity that is beyond everything and cannot be compared to anything. Okay? There are lower, I'm going to put it in air quotes, lower aspects of divinity that says something like Na'aseh Adam, let us make man. That's one aspect of divinity talking to another aspect of divinity. But at the highest level, there is no Na'aseh, let us. At the highest level, there's just me, says God. Ani anihu. Okay? Everyone follow that? Ani anihu, ve'ein Elohim imadi. They quote the verse for the third time. It is me. There's no other God next to me that I might ask counsel from it, which means when God says on the sixth day, let's make man, that's not the Ein Sof who is saying that. Okay? Because at that Ein Sof level, so passage 1 calls it Ein Sof, the infinite. Passage 2 calls it Ilat al kol ilot, the cause beyond all causes. And I've underlined it here at the end of the passage. It does not have a second or a partner or a number. Okay? That Ein Sof is unlike anything else. And you can't say that anything else is like it. Again, like Maimonides, it is defined negatively. There is nothing, it is fundamentally unlike anything else. All other causes have a cause. We didn't get to the Sefirot yet. We will next week, God willing. All other levels of divinity have a level above and below. This is a level of divinity that has no above. It is incomparable. It is infinite. I want to point out both of those things are negative definitions. Infinite is a negative definition, not finite. It doesn't say what it is it says what it's not. Okay. Third passage from the Zohar. I'm on page 3 of the handout if you're okay. Yep. He rules over all and none rules over him. He grasps everything, comprehends everything, and nothing comprehends him. And, okay, the Zohar is very fond of looking at the different names of God in the Bible and saying they connote different aspects of divinity. And this higher level, it is not even called Yud, He, and Vav, He, the ineffable name of God. The Ein Sof has no name. Ein Sof is not called Yud, He, Vav, He, or any of the other names until it spreads out its light. That's what I mean by the image. When Ein Sof spreads out its light to, air quotes, lower aspects, then those lower aspects have names. Yud, He, and Vav, He, Elohim, Eloah, El, all of those are lower aspects of God. They're still above us, okay? But they're not the highest. And when God departs from them, meaning from those names, then God, God's self, has no name. So Ein Sof, there are other names of God, Yud, He, Vav, He, El, Elohim, Shaddai, El Shaddai, okay? Ein Sof has no name, as it says in Ecclesiastes, Kohelet. Amok, Amok, Mi Yimtza'enu. It is very, very deep. Hold on. And there's no light that can illuminate it. Any light that illuminates it, there's no light that can withstand his radiance without appearing dark. Okay? It's so radiant that any other light, any other aspect of divinity that you would say, appears dark compared to it. I want to finish this. Ihu sovev kol almin, he surrounds all worlds, but nothing surrounds him, really, or it. Okay? Up or down or on any of the right. So God surrounds everything, but nothing is outside of God. He fills all the worlds, but nothing fills him. God fills all the worlds, nothing fills God's. He grants life to them, and nothing else gives life to them. We brought it to the Siddur, as it says in Nehemiah, Ve'ata mechaye et kulam. You give life to everything. We read that every morning right before Az Yashir. Ve'ata mechaye et kulam, u'lecha levadcha kulam mishachavim, something like that. You give life to everything. Okay? So what does this mean? So I just want to summarize. God has no name. God is the infinite light that any other aspect of divinity compared to it is like darkness. God surrounds all worlds, all existence. God fills all existence. God gives life to everything. God unites everything. By the way, the last little paragraph. And he talks about the 4 elements, that they believed in: earth, air, fire, and water. God is the 4th that binds everything. Okay? I'm going to pause. So here's an example of what I mean by, good examples of what I mean by the Zohar uses imagistic language to talk about the mysteries of existence. So there's I'm going to summarize, then we'll pause for questions, comments, right? There is the highest aspect of divinity. This is called Ein Sof, the infinite. And I only brought you one Ein Sof passage. There are lots of other Ein Sof passages. Or cause of causes. Okay? It gives life to everything. It surrounds everything. It fills everything. There is nothing beyond it. And it is incomprehensible. It cannot be known. Right? And you might say, well, that's a lot like Maimonides. To which I would say, yeah, except it's a little bit more imagistic, right? I don't know that Rambam would say there's nothing above it. He would just say, he sort of said it in a very short philosophical way. Space and time do not pertain to it. That's all Rambam said. Beyond time, beyond space. And the Zohar says it in a little bit more flowery and imagistic. Nothing rules it. Nothing grasps it. There is nothing apart from it. It is the thing that surrounds everything, but nothing surrounds it. Nothing's outside of God. It is the thing that fills everything, but nothing fills God. Okay? It gives life to everything, but nothing gives life to God. Follow all that? So all vitality, force, reality, space-time emanates from the deity, created by the deity, but none of it actually applies to the deity. It's a more imagistic way of talking about God than we saw in Maimonides. But I think it boils down to pretty much the same thing. That's the Ein Sof. By the way, footnote, there are 10 sefirot. The top one is Keter, crown. Keter is the one we can't know anything about. It's a point. There are arguments in the Zohar about, are Keter and Ein Sof the same thing? Or is Ein Sof something that is even beyond Keter? Okay? What I brought you is a passage that's basically saying the Ein Sof is beyond Keter. All the other sefirot are connected somehow to the world. Ein Sof it's not connected, except it is connected because it sends down vitality and does stuff, right? But it by itself is complete. Now, I just want to say, if this sounds to you like gobbledygook, like, okay, but this is kind of the language of the Zohar. Okay, I'm going to pause for comment. Michael, question?
I was wondering whether the phrase Melech Malchei Malachim is intended to be another way of it.
Well, historically, that's not true, because historically that comes from rabbinics, okay, which is earlier than the Zohar. And one would have to dig into the Zohar and say, because the Zohar comments on all names of God. And one could dig into the question of, does the Zohar say Melech Malchei Malachim is the Ein Sof? Or is that just one of the lower names of God? Don't know the answer. It does seem to say in this passage, by the way, the Zohar is not a systematic work, which means not everything in the Zohar agrees with everything else in the Zohar. Okay. I'd like to point out superficially, not everything in the Bible agrees with everything else in the Bible. Not everything in the Talmud agrees with everything else in the Talmud. Consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. It should all fit together perfectly. Okay, so it doesn't. But in this passage, Michael, it seems to say that which we are calling Ein Sof has none of the names of God. It's beyond all the names, which is another way of saying it's beyond language, which is another way of saying all the various names we have for God are attempts to express various aspects of God, but there is something that is beyond all of that, that is not languageable, that is not comprehensible, that is not seeable. Again, it's negative definition. So by definition, we can't, how are you supposed to imagine something that is unimaginable? How are you supposed to describe something that is indescribable? By the way, if you read, I don't know, there are all these books that are written about Zen Buddhism and Jewish mysticism, because there are all these Jews who got turned off by Hebrew school, in the 60s and 70s. So they became Buddhists, and then they write books about this, about, Buddhism and Jewish mysticism. And there are people who write about, it's interesting that there are various world mystical traditions that come to the same conclusions and use the same language, like rose petals unfolding is not language that only appears in the Zohar, but nowhere else in world mystical literature. Or a point of light which spreads out into flows of light. It's not like the only place it says that is the Zohar, but nowhere else. Right? So if you read some of this, you say by the way, I said this about Maimonides. He says, God is the knower, God is the known, God is the knowledge. Like, oh, I read that in some Buddhist book that I read when I was 19 years old in college. God is the dancer and God is the dance and they're all one. So what that means possibly is that it is possible that people who are deep contemplatives in many different traditions come to similar conclusions. The idea that things are separate, but beyond them, if we look deeper into them, they're all connected to one source. It's not like Chabad, the Tanya, it's not like that's the only place where that thought is expressed in the world. Okay, that's sort of at its core, you could say that's monotheism, except for Rambam's monotheism, God is outside of all that. Whereas for mysticism, God is in all that. Although the passage we just read says, nope, there's an aspect of God. God might fill all that because the Ein Sof chooses to do that, but there's some aspect of God which is somehow remote and separate from all. Well, I guess that's our closing thought as we head into Rosh Hashanah. So, as they say in Aramaic, Pit Katava, which means may you have a good kvittel, good note, which means may you be inscribed well. Shana Tova Umtuka. All the Israelis, all the time when they sign off, say, for the last 11 months, about to be 12 months, they're saying, Shinishma Bisorot Tovot. May we hear good tidings. And Shana Tova Umtuka. And God willing, I'll see you next Tuesday. We'll be together in 5785.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.